Hey guys, this is Matteo and we need to talk about Flux again. I spent quite some time with this model and I've heard all sort of metropolitan legend about it and how to get the best results, but nothing really worked for me. And the most frustrating thing is that a configuration that seemed fine for an image didn't really work for another. So I took the bull by the horns and tested the hell out of Flux. I generated thousands of images with all combinations of samplers, schedulers, guidance, shift and steps. Everything repeated for different subjects, prompt length and with multiple seeds. It took days to generate all these images on my 4090 and on an RTX 6000 very kindly offered by Peter from Banodoko. Then of course I needed to make sense of all this data, and I think now I have a better sense of how the model works, but the bad news is that it's complicated. And I'm probably going to leave you with more questions than answers. For this project, I heavily used the Flux sampler with parameters node. It can generate automatically dozens of images with multiple parameters, and it can output a grid like this. It's in the ComfUI Essentials extension. We briefly talked about it in a previous video. I'll show you real quick how it works again. So this is a standard Flux workflow. I can add a Flux sampler parameters node and connect directly the model pipeline, the conditioning and the latent. This node alone basically replaces all the default nodes that we can safely remove now. You can use it to generate images like before, just with less clutter, but the real power comes with annotation. There's another node called plot sampler parameters. I connect it to the VEI, to the parameters coming from the sampler, and now I get all the data that generated this image printed at the bottom. Okay, now if I click on an input of the sampler, you'll see that they are all text fields. For example, let's say I want to test Euler and days. I can write the two samplers divided by a comma, and the node will iterate through all the options. The images are still separate generations because Colt's number is -1. If I set it to 0, the two images will be merged together, like so. Or I can set the number of columns to 2, and now the cats are on a row. If this is too much information, I can select changes only from this option, and now only the parameters that actually change will be displayed. If you don't remember the samplers or scheduler's name, you can use the sampler helper and the scheduler helper. Convert the widget to input, connect it to the helper, and select all you want. For numerical fields, you can separate values with a comma like before, or use the notation 1 3 dots 20 plus 1. And the node will test all the numbers from 1 to 20. There's another node that is very important, and it's the text encode for sampler parameters. This one will let us iterate through multiple prompts at once. I need to connect the clip, copy this prompt, put it in a new encoder, and delete the old one. Now if I want to test the second prompt, I can simply add 3 dashes on a new line and write the new prompt: a black dog sitting on a table. If I queue now, the node will generate 6 images. That will be 2 for the prompts multiplied the 3 samplers. Perfect. I can also display the prompt, and I can order the images by sampler and let the node take care of the columns. And now we can easily evaluate all the images and their parameters. So this is how all the pictures for my test were generated. The first thing I wanted to check was how many steps we actually need to converge. And here I got the first surprise. So let's start with portraits. There are 3 batches of 21 images each. The first batch is a very short prompt, just a quick sentence like close-up of a beautiful redhead wearing a green sweater. The second is adding a little more details. It's more or less the length I would normally prompt an image. And the last one is generated with an LLM, and it's very descriptive. The columns are the number of steps, starting from 10 to 40. From a distance, they all seem fine, with the exception of 10 steps, but let's analyze them in detail. At 10 steps, the image is formed, but still blurry and undefined. 15 steps is probably our starting point, and at 20 it gets better, but it seems that it really wants to converge at 25. At 30, something happens. The head position changes, but the jawline on the left seems way too big, and the cheek is hallucinated. At 35, the model starts to correct these issues, and it's only at 40 that the image has finally converged. This means that if I had stopped at 30, I'd ended up with a wrong image. With this other seed, it happens something similar. At 20 steps, the image seems fine. You'd be tempted to add another 5 steps just to get more details. But the image changes and actually stabilizes only at 35. Of course, I've tried various subjects. With more complex scenes, 15 steps are rarely enough. And also in this case, the image seems fine at 25, but at 30 it changes again to stabilize only at 40. Here I went up to 50 steps, but it doesn't change much. Similar scene, the man works on an invisible piece of furniture up to 25 steps, and at 40 the image changes completely to stabilize only at 50. Things get worse with subjects that Flux is not very good at, like this alien. The image is not bad per se, but it's pretty far from the prompt. The alien was supposed to have 4 eyes, for example. Anyway, at 20 all seems good. Let's add 5 steps to improve details, and nope. I got this weird ear, and the image really converges only around 50 steps. I have hundreds of examples, and it's a behavior that I saw very often, albeit not always. It seems like the model is trained to converge in tiers. The first tier is at about 20-25 steps. The image generally looks very good already, but between 25 and 30 we have a second tier, and sometimes the images change again at 40-45. The problem is that if you fall between tiers, the image won't be completely formed, and you'd need another 5 steps at least to remove all the small imperfections. Unfortunately, it's not deterministic. Sometimes it can be at 25 steps, others at 35, others it actually never happens. The good news is that the length of the prompt doesn't impact much the image quality, and overly complicated prompts are not really necessary. For illustrations, it's a completely different story, and we'll talk about that in a moment. First, we need to check samplers and schedulers. There's always someone who tells you that one sampler is better than another, and that you should not use these or that. Well, I have tried them all, and with multiple subjects and multiple seeds. So, I ran this test at 15, 20 and 35 steps. At 15 we will see which sampler-scheduler combo is able to remove most of the noise, and at 20 we should have our fully formed image. I'm not going to show you all the images one by one, but what I'm basically looking for is the presence of a residual noise, like here on the nose and the cheek, or if the image has this ultra sharp effect often visible on the teeth. Considering all these parameters, at least for realistic photos, the best performing samplers are, in no particular order, DPM adaptive, DPM++ 2M, IPNDM, DACE, DDIM, UniPC BH2. Euler is also fine, but it needs a few more steps. Regarding scheduler, SGM, uniform, simple, and beta are all fine. In a completely different league, we find DDIM uniform. It's the only scheduler that creates a different kind of image, and I absolutely love it. At 20 step, it generated this cute picture, but at 35 the image changed and it started to converge closer to all the other schedulers. So it's a bit of a splinter cell. If you feel lucky, totally give it a try. Now let's talk about illustrations. Flux with medium length prompts always like to make things more realistic, and the more steps, the more detailed it gets, up to becoming a completely different style. In this first row, I have Euler at 15, 20 and 35 steps. As you can see, we go from an almost clip art style to a more defined digital illustration. And while Euler has still residual noise at 15 steps with a realistic photo, with a drawing it's just perfect. And this result is consistent with most of the samplers and schedulers, with the exception of our beloved DDIM uniform. In this case, the image is fully formed already at 15 steps, even though it really converges at 20. So here there's no right or wrong, it's mostly a question of personal taste, but there are some samplers that objectively performed not well. For example, DPM++ 2M in this task is very slow to converge, and also UniPC BH2 that fared pretty well in the photo category here struggles a little. So my suggestions for illustration are Euler, DPM adaptive, DACE, DDIM. Schedulers always SGM uniform, simple, DDIM uniform and beta. One last test with our alien. Not many surprises here, most samplers performed better also at lower steps, but what I wanted to show you is Karas. It never performed well with the previous tests, but in this kind of very weird scenario, I kinda like it. It created a very rough, foggy image, but in this case it fits the prompt, so don't be too hasty discarding schedulers. Apart from that, they all did well, and again DDIM uniform is the only one that generated unique images. Okay, next, guidance. The default guidance is 3.5, which is a very safe bet. It's a value that generally grants little hallucination and good text, if you have any. In reality, I feel it's a little too safe. Generally speaking, more guidance gives you more polished and saturated images. But for a more realistic and maybe cinematic result, I like to lower the guidance a little, but this is of course completely up to your personal taste. In this case, for example, I really like what happens at low guidance. The colors are a bit washed out, but that can be easily fixed in post. Also remember that you can set the guidance to 0 and sometimes the result is really nice. The only value to avoid is 1. Guidance is probably multiplied to some other value at some point, and multiplying by 1 doesn't change anything. Different story for illustrations. Higher guidance gives you stronger style, so you might want to play with that together with a number of steps. I also made a test with logo and text. Again, a lower guidance gives us a more rough style. I personally really like the image generated at guidance 2, but between 3 and 4 the image is more polished. If you go too high, it starts to hallucinate and the text doesn't work anymore. Okay, one more thing, the default node doesn't allow guidance lower than 0, but with my sampler you can actually use whatever value. In this test I tried to prompt a watercolor painting. In the bottom right we have our base 3.5 guidance that generated a kind of digital illustration with a background of watercolors. Lowering the guidance, I was able to get closer to what I wanted, and at 0.5 it's actually a pretty good artistry watercolor. Also very beautiful at -2. I don't know exactly what happens with negative guidance, but it works and often you get pretty good images. Okay, we are almost done. We only need to talk about base and max shift. First of all, shift is related to the image size. In a model sampling node, you should set the same width and height of the generated image, and the aspect ratio will change how the shift is applied. At 1:1 ratio, base shift has no effect, and only max shift is used. Going in portrait and landscape mode, they start to have a greater impact. In this image, I have max shift in the rows and base shift in the columns. At first glance, there seems to be very little difference. At higher max shift, here in the bottom, the colors are more saturated, and at 1.5 she has a bigger smile. If I move up, you see at 0.75 and 0.5 the sweater becomes simpler and less detailed. But if I zoom in on the face, you see that she needs some skincare, but also that the image is very blurry. Let me move to a higher shift value to check the difference. Now you see how much more noise we have in this image. On the nose, the forehead and the eyelashes are also hallucinated. If I move up to about 1.25, the noise is almost completely gone. So it seems that a higher shift introduces more noise. On one side, it makes things sharper, but also can cause hallucination. The model seems trained at a noise level around 1.5 of max shift, and in fact the default is 1.15. If the image has some weird artifacts, or if you want a softer result, you can try to lower the shift a little. If you want to introduce more details, you can instead increase it. Of course, you need to keep into account the noise size. In this other example, I have a full figure, so each noise speckle will have a higher impact than on a portrait. If I go at the bottom, you see a lot of noise. Of course, you can increase the number of steps, but with more steps, the sampler has more time to remove the noise, and you'll get a smoother and smoother result. So you need to strike a balance. With this subject, it's interesting to note that at a very low shift, the model made a very nice style and also a very interesting choice of bra. But basically, the sampler saw less noise and decided to go full illustration. So what's the conclusion here? Well, there are already way too many variables without taking base and max shift into account. You can play a little with them, staying around the default values to try to remove artifacts or slightly increase details, but I wouldn't stress too much about them. Okay, if you think I have given you enough to play with, well, think again, because we are going to talk about attention patching next. You may have heard of the clip attention multiply node. It's used to change the weight of the clip encoder, but it's a bit of a placebo. You can get some good results, but it varies a lot based on the prompt, and most importantly, it only patches the clip L. It doesn't have any effect on the more important T5. So out with the old, in with the new. I made the Flux Attention Seeker node. You can find it in the ComfUI Essential extension. Just remember to upgrade because I send constant updates. This one allows to change the weight of each block, both for clip L and T5. Here on the top you can choose what vector of the block you want to patch. We have query, key, value and output. I'm not going into too many details here, but basically the proportion between query and key determines the relevance of the embedding. The two are compared and the result is applied to the value to obtain the actual weight of the block. The product of this operation is finally multiplied to the output matrix. That basically prepares the result for the next block. So if you want to change the behavior of a block, you can change the proportion between Q and key. If you increase them both, you only change their magnitude, but not their relationship. If you instead want to change only the weight of the block, you work mostly with value, out, or both. Okay, so let's see how it works in practice. Clip L has usually a lower effect, so can be useful to steer the composition a little. Let me enable value and out only, and then I'm setting the first 5 blocks to the maximum. I'm also increasing just a smidge the first and the last block of the T5 encoder that are both very important layers. Here I'm just trying to exaggerate the effect to show you the difference. In reality you probably want to be more subtle. In the prompt I have Van Gogh painting. Flux is not very good at styles, especially with long prompts, but here I'm trying to force the model into a painting effect. And in fact I get this cute kind of digital painting. Of course we can combine multiple attention seekers. In the first one I'm selecting query only, and in the second key. I'm resetting both, and for query I'm maxing out the T5 and I leave the second unaltered for now. If I generate I should get a pretty different illustration. Let's see. Yeah, very nice. Okay, remember I said that it's the proportion between key and Q that matters. If I set the key to a very low value, the proportion will be again close as it was at the beginning. And if I generate, I get more or less the same image as it was without any patching. Now, before rushing to the comments, the answer is no. I don't know what each block does. And things get even more complicated considering that you can take 2 prompts and patch them in a different way to then combine them. This way you could, for example, try to push the style in one prompt and the composition in the other, but I think I gave you enough food for thoughts already. Let's leave that for another time. So what do we get out of all this mess? Well, mostly that Flux is a very rigid model, not very prone to tinkering. If what you want falls within its realms, the results are great. Otherwise, it's very difficult to govern. The good news is that it's a huge dataset, so all the information is actually there. At the moment, the T5 and the weird training are not able to get everything out. But probably a good IP adapter will. There are a couple of projects already. They are not very good at the moment, so we will have to wait a little longer. Okay then, I think that's all I have for today. I hope you found this video useful. See you next time. Ciao.